How do you say house in Spanish?
Casa.
How do you say dog in Spanish?
Perro.
How do you say car in Spanish?
Coche.
How do you say book in Spanish?
Libro.
How do you say apple in Spanish?
Manzana.
How do you say cat in Spanish?
Gato.
How do you say tree in Spanish?
Árbol.
How do you say school in Spanish?
Escuela.
How do you say water in Spanish?
Agua.
How do you say sun in Spanish?
Sol.
How do you say moon in Spanish?
Luna.
How do you say chair in Spanish?
Silla.
How do you say table in Spanish?
Mesa.
How do you say bed in Spanish?
Cama.
How do you say window in Spanish?
Ventana.
How do you say door in Spanish?
Puerta.
How do you say road in Spanish?
Camino.
How do you say pen in Spanish?
Bolígrafo.
How do you say pencil in Spanish?
Lápiz.
How do you say paper in Spanish?
Papel.
How do you say bookstore in Spanish?
Librería.
How do you say library in Spanish?
Biblioteca.
How do you say teacher in Spanish?
Maestro.
How do you say student in Spanish?
Estudiante.
How do you say bottle in Spanish?
Botella.
How do you say bag in Spanish?
Bolsa.
How do you say shirt in Spanish?
Camisa.
How do you say shoes in Spanish?
Zapatos.
How do you say pants in Spanish?
Pantalones.
How do you say hat in Spanish?
Sombrero.
How do you say clock in Spanish?
Reloj.
How do you say phone in Spanish?
Teléfono.
How do you say computer in Spanish?
Computadora.
How do you say music in Spanish?
Música.
How do you say song in Spanish?
Canción.
How do you say movie in Spanish?
Película.
How do you say ocean in Spanish?
Océano.
How do you say river in Spanish?
Río.
How do you say mountain in Spanish?
Montaña.
How do you say flower in Spanish?
Flor.
How do you say food in Spanish?
Comida.
How do you say milk in Spanish?
Leche.
How do you say bread in Spanish?
Pan.
How do you say butter in Spanish?
Mantequilla.
How do you say cheese in Spanish?
Queso.
How do you say meat in Spanish?
Carne.
How do you say fish in Spanish?
Pescado.
How do you say salad in Spanish?
Ensalada.
How do you say soup in Spanish?
Sopa.
How do you say fruit in Spanish?
Fruta.
How do you say vegetable in Spanish?
Verdura.
How do you say knife in Spanish?
Cuchillo.
How do you say fork in Spanish?
Tenedor.
How do you say spoon in Spanish?
Cuchara.
How do you say plate in Spanish?
Plato.
How do you say cup in Spanish?
Taza.